Amen. Awesome, guys. Well, I don't know if anybody was confused when they walked in and saw the tent. That's just because we have a 6 o'clock service, so I just figured I'd just stay here all day and take a nap in between. But no, I'm just kidding. That is for something. We will get there, and anyways, that's actually for something. But anyways, hey, I'm Chris. If I think I've met most of you guys in the room, but I know there's lots of people online. If we haven't met, then a little bit about me. I get to be one of the pastors here, which is really awesome. And I have the most fun job because I get to hang out and mentor students and generally just basically run a rodeo around here, which is a lot of fun. And so what I love about that is because like students, like some of you guys are in here, you guys are just in this really, really awesome time of life. I mean, obviously it hasn't been so awesome this year, but you guys are in this awesome time of life where God is literally just shaping you who you are becoming. And I just get to be a part of that. And that's absolutely like the best job in the whole world. And the other thing that I really love about hanging out with students is that sometimes it pushes me to do like really stupid things that I maybe normally wouldn't, but then you get really good stories like this one. So we've got a garage out there, right? And so the other day, some of the grade 8 boys were skateboarding in there. We built this skateboard ramp. And if you're good at skateboarding, it's a pretty mellow transition. It's actually not that hard, but I grew up on a gravel road. Skateboarding is not a thing out there, right? So I'm like, well, I'm not going to get shown up by these grade 8 boys. They're actually getting pretty good at it. And I was like, well, I'll see if I can drop in, all right? So first 2 times I fell, it wasn't too bad. It doesn't hurt too bad. And then the third time I was like, all right, I'm gonna really send this one, all right? So really, I got this one, and so I got up there and I sent it just a little bit too hard because I was full Superman position, headed towards the concrete. Shoulder makes contact, and I could feel it trying to pop out. And then I didn't, thankfully, but I was just like laying on the concrete for like 5 minutes, just like, oh, that was so stupid. Why did I do that? And I actually sprained my shoulder, so it's okay now. But yeah, some of the stupid things you do. Gravity quickly taught me that I'm a lot more fragile than I think sometimes. And hey, like funny story, but funny story aside, we're talking about this one word today called fragile. And what do I do when I feel fragile and cracked and broken? And guys, that's a big question, and that's a really hard question to have the courage to look in the mirror and face today. But I want us to have courage to not just hide, not just to come to church, hide the fact that, I've got cracks in my life, or find the ways to ignore it. But what if we really, really looked in the mirror and saw our own fragility? And what if God actually wants to speak a really powerful word into that? C.S. Lewis, the great imagination from which sprung Aslan and Lucy and Reepicheep and all the magical world of Narnia. Any Narnia fans in here? Yeah. Anybody read it in the past year? Maybe a couple of you guys? No. Okay. Well, that's okay. But he was one of the greatest faith thinkers of our generation, of our time. But he wrote the books of Narnia, and he wrote lots of other things. But he also wrote these 4 short essays called "A Grief Observed." He had written some papers called "The Problem of Pain," but "The Grief Observed" was his own experience with loss and losing his wife and his love. And I just wanted to open up with a quote from that today, because I think this year a lot of us have realized that we're fragile. A lot of us have started to see the cracks. And what do we do? Maybe you felt this way. C.S. Lewis says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid, the same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning I keep on swallowing. At other times it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There's this sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It's so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me, but I dread the moments that the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me." Maybe you felt like that. at different times in your life. There's another moment this year when I realized that sometimes our fragility, we aren't in control of it. Sometimes it just comes and completely blindsides us. Like when I spent this last Christmas in the hospital. So I had this gum infection. It was totally fine, whatever. Just a little bit sick before Christmas. But then Christmas Eve, it exploded into these sores in my mouth and down my throat. And by Christmas morning, I was actually like a little bit afraid because I couldn't even swallow water. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to breathe. So I went into the hospital and just no answers. They didn't even know what was going on, just medication, just to bide the time while I healed. And that's where a lot of us find ourselves this year, face to face with the fact that we are fragile. We're looking in the mirror and we're seeing the cracks form in us and we feel helpless. Like some of us this year has brought physical breaking. Or maybe you look in the mirror and the stress and anxiety of, has just changed you and absolutely shattered you emotionally and mentally. Or maybe you thought you were a pretty strong person, but that you could hold it together, but depression and anxiety just have you feeling shattered on the floor. Whatever it is, whether it's financially, your marriage, school, disappointment, the experience of loss. Maybe your faith has formed more cracks this year than you're willing to admit here at church, and you don't even know if God is even there anymore. So many of us, we just wish we could just do that. We could just take the medication and wait till it's better. We are fragile, though. And we do have cracks. And some of us aren't sure how maybe you got here today. Maybe you're, at home and you're like, I don't even know how I found enough pieces to pick up off the floor to get together just to make it here. And I just want to say that, let's just have courage and face that in the mirror today. Because every single one of us at some point is going to walk through suffering. That might not be your reality right now. You might be going, actually life's pretty good. But every single one of us is going to walk through suffering at some point in one degree or another. And in those moments, I just want to give permission for us this morning. We all wrestle with the questions. Has God abandoned me when I feel fragile? Is his blessing gone? Is he there anymore? Maybe he just doesn't even care. Maybe he's not powerful enough. Because the experience of suffering is real, and whether or not that experience is yours right now, we will walk through it. And so I want us to face that today. It's easier to hide it. But I think, guys, that God actually wants to speak a powerful word into the middle of our fragileness. Because what if suffering isn't the silence of God, but the beginning of new life? So if you got a Bible, would you turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 4? If you got a phone, would you turn over there? It's just going to be way more helpful if you have something in front of you, just because, hey, we're not going to solve the world's problems in 30 minutes here, but I think it's actually something that we should continue to wrestle with, something that we can go back and reflect on, because there's some really cool images under this text. And 2 Corinthians, as you're turning, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, it's been one of my favorite, I guess you call it, books of the Bible. It's become one of them because it's such a real letter, right? Like it's real people spoken out of real suffering, but it gives real hope as well. And I really have come to love this passage. And let me just take some time and just read it for us as we start. So if you got it, Google it, whatever, and I'll read it for us. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I'm going to start in verse 1. We're kind of been working from verse 7 on, but just it makes more sense if I read through it. But all right. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul is writing this, and he says, "Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we don't lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they can't see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, and ourselves as servants for your sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not us. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. We're going to keep going, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And I think one of the reasons I've come to love 2 Corinthians so much is because it's so real life, and this image of a jar of clay is just like, I don't know, it's just become really powerful in my life. And I think that it's really powerful because at times Christianity has been pitched to us as like this way towards prosperity, right? And a happy life. Like, believe these things and God will like you, so then God's going to bless your marriage, he's going to bless your business, your family, your money, whatever it is. And if we're really honest, like, we all do sometimes believe that perspective. But what happens is then when those things are taken away, and all of us have at some point said, well, God, then where are you? Like, have you abandoned me? I was upset the other day. I was kind of like scrolling through Instagram, and I saw like some hip preacher dude on Instagram, and he was like, oh, I don't believe in the prosperity gospel, but I believe that Christianity is a religion of prosperity, and saying how following Christ would lead to God blessing your life. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was anyone in his audience, I don't know, with cancer, or who had just been divorced, or who like showed up to church that day like just so broken, but they made it there, and all they needed was some encouragement, and they're seeing what he's saying, they're seeing the gap in between what he's saying in their life, and they're going like, well, maybe it doesn't work for me. And I just wonder how they would hear that, Like, I actually kind of wondered in that moment, I was like, I wonder how the people that Jesus actually hung out with would have heard that. Like lepers, outcasts, poor, prostitutes. See, here's what I actually believe about the Bible, is that when you take time to listen to the story of the Bible, it tells an upside-down gospel, a different good news. See, as much as I wish it was simple as like, hey, just trust Jesus and everything's going to work out, it's also not what Jesus himself said, but he did say, I'm with you, right? See, the good news is that suffering doesn't mean that God isn't with you. Suffering doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. Actually, the opposite is true, and that's exactly the context that 2 Corinthians is written into. See, Paul had planted this Jesus community in Greece, right, in Corinth. And so these people were really close, like spiritual children to Paul. But he left to go plant some more churches, and the place just became a mess. And the people started to doubt Paul. And then there actually was these people in the church who disliked Paul. So they started teaching things against him so that it would undermine him, so that people would turn against him. They were pointing out his sufferings and using that to discredit him. Like, well, if God is with you, then why are you going through all these hardships? See, because you can actually read about Paul in the book of Acts. And he lived a really hard life. When he turned towards Christ, he was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was persecuted, and he often lived in poverty and prison. He was sick. He had what he called himself a thorn in his side. That despite serving Christ so faithfully, and these enemies, they started turning people against him. So not only does Paul have this tremendous physical suffering, but now he's experienced the loss of friendship and people that he loved turning on him. Paul had been preaching this message to these different communities. Hey, Jesus is putting the pieces back together. The kingdom of God has begun through forgiveness and beating death on the cross. But any of us can open our eyes and see, well, the suffering still exists in the world. And so how could God be with Paul? Oh, obviously you're not being blessed by God, because look at your life. And I think we too wrestle with this. Like, what do we do with suffering? Not in our own lives, but in our world. Like, does suffering in the world really mean that Christianity is just pointless? I think about it this way. Paul, who planted so many churches, he did so much work for God. He suffered so much for Jesus. And then he died in prison. So what do we do when suffering seems to have the final word in our life? Well, as you read through 2 Corinthians, you get something from Paul you go, this story's upside down. See, in Paul's mind, the story of Jesus tells a different good news, one that turns suffering upside down, because suffering doesn't actually get the final word. That whatever you are suffering doesn't mean that God isn't with you, but that God is actually, through suffering, opening a door of hope. He actually saw it so differently. He wrote this in chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians, just a couple pages before. He says this, "For we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, and so also our comfort abounds through Christ." See, the Christian story tells us that in the middle of our suffering, when we feel the most fragile, when it feels like death and evil get the final word, that's actually when we are closest to Christ. We walk in his footsteps, the one who through suffering brought life into the world. The one who was crucified, and yet that was his mission, to bring life into the world. So what if, guys, when we look in the mirror and we come face to face with our own fragility this year, that it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us, but what if that's actually the moment where true discipleship actually begins? That's what I want to wrestle with today. There's this really cool little illustration here. This really cool Japanese art form called kintsugi. Probably butchered that, but it's the art of taking something broken and mending it with gold. And classic Japanese fashion is not just about the making something new, but it's got some sort of deep meaning, and it's really cool. And so, say for example, you had a teacup from your grandma, and your teacup shatters. What are you gonna do? I guess you got to throw the teacup out. But what kintsugi is, it's the art of taking those pieces and actually mending it back with gold. Not just fixing it to its original state, but actually creating something more valuable and more beautiful. Actually, I have a picture up there, but I was gonna get one so I could show you guys, but I was like, they're actually pretty expensive, because I was like, I probably can't justify a $100 teacup. So, But it's not just that something old is fixed, but that something is actually created that is new, that is more beautiful, more valuable. And what kintsugi says, the art form, it says that that something broken is now actually has the prerequisite to become something completely new. Not because of the cracks. It's not the cracks that make it valuable, but because of what filled them. The value and the beauty doesn't come from themselves, but something that came from outside of them. And I just want to be really clear, I don't think that this is teaching, or the Bible is teaching, that we need to find the silver lining in every hard thing in your life. I don't think that's true at all. But what happens when we do find ourselves broken is that maybe God can actually create something new and even more valuable. That's hard to wrestle with. But he says it here, we'll start in verse 6, but if you have a pen, just underline, highlight verse 7. He says this, for God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. So God's doing this new creation work through Christ. It's almost like, hey, you know how God spoke and life came into being? Well, that's what's happening through Jesus. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. See, I think this passage has become one of my favorite, because Paul uses this image to completely flip our idea of what it means to have hope in the gospel. I think it's become one of my favorite images because it actually gives me permission to be fragile. See, they didn't have Tupperware in the ancient Near East, and so a lot of things were kept in clay pots. It's actually how we differentiate different archaeological sites and stuff like that. I actually had some friends who got to go to Israel, and so you find pot shards all over, and that's how they go, oh, this was from this era, and this was from this era, and they actually found 2 of these big pots. They were part of the dig that found them, and they're huge. They're 4 or 5 feet tall, and they're this big, and so they actually got to take them home and display them in the library of the school that they were with, and they're really, really cool. They're absolutely huge. But there was all sorts of kind of storage, but this was the most common kind of storage in the day, from wine to grain to treasure, but often valuable treasures were kept in plain clay pots to conceal what was inside. And I was like, oh, come on, that's so cool. Let me say that again. The valuable treasure is kept in the fragile pot. That's where it's kept. That's the picture Paul gives to the people doubting him because he's suffering, and they're saying, oh, Paul, we don't need to listen to you because look, God's not with you. And he's saying, no, suffering doesn't tell us that God has abandoned us. It's actually a pointer that there's something even more valuable inside. The outside may be fragile, but that's because the treasure never came because of us, but because of God's power shown even through our cracks. What if weakness is actually where discipleship to Jesus begins? I think this gives us tremendous hope as we walk through suffering in life because it completely changes the narrative. This narrative that we often believe, like, the outside matters, right? My happiness is tied to my success or my followers or my marriage or whatever I envision this phase of life to be, and pleasure becomes God and pain the enemy, right? Now, I know what we're talking about today is a little bit different because, we're talking about, well, what do I do, like, when my life is literally falling to pieces? But I think that narrative that always gets told to us is, it leaves us with this expectation that we should never expect to be broken. But the story of Jesus tells us instead that the unavoidable reality that we are fragile is exactly the place where we find that God's power will always surpass ours. Look at what God has done in Christ. It's like this new creation is starting in its hope and its beauty, and yet for a little while longer, we still carry it around in fragile jars of clay. See, the amount of cracks in the vessel doesn't change the power or the value of the treasure inside. Instead, just like the one we claim to follow, our cracks reveal that God is giving us hope beyond the jar, hope even when we realize that we are fragile. Why? Because death doesn't get the final word. See, the cracks that this year has revealed in your life, the diagnosis or disappointment, the abandonment, the loss of friendship, job opportunities, see, these don't get the last word, even though right now it might feel like it. That's the offer in Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, the announcement that God is starting to put the pieces of a broken world back together again through Jesus is the one thing that can transform suffering, and so we don't lose heart. Even when the worst comes, because the worst doesn't get the final word. Jesus has already said the final word. It is finished. And I was just thinking about, like, what other worldview gives this framework? Like, only Christianity gives this framework. Only Christianity can make this next sentence in verse 8 make any sense at all. It says this: we are hard pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down and not destroyed. See, like, atheism says, oh, these things are just par for the course. So, you can't do anything about it. If you're suffering, whatever. Like, you can't do anything about it. Life's hard and then you die, so get the good life now. Yeah, New Age says it's karma or it's something wrong with you. So, like, if you're suffering, it's because of something that you did, and then the other religions say that God is punishing you, and this thing's happening to you because God's showing that, oh, this wasn't okay. And all of these things say that if you don't have the power to change it, you're hopeless. But Christianity says that God is in the business of turning our fragility into new life. That brokenness doesn't actually disqualify you from discipleship. That's actually where the transformation begins. That the gospel of Jesus is the one thing that can actually transform our suffering. See, Christianity says that Jesus was the good shepherd who walked into the valley with you. Christianity says that Jesus walks into the valley with you, not just for you so you don't have to, but with you so you can walk out the other side with him. That no matter what comes, death, depression and diagnosis, disease or disappointment, that he will walk with you and lead you out the other side. So maybe discipleship to Jesus doesn't begin at that moment when I invited Jesus into my heart at camp or at church. As important as those moments are, what if discipleship to Jesus actually begins in the breaking so that we can be made something brand new and beautiful? Let me put it another way. Tragedy actually becomes transformation because when we break, we can be made into something new and better. Paul says it here. We carry around in our body the death of Jesus. Why? So that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. This next sentence is really the pinnacle. since we have the same spirit of faith, he just quoted out of the Psalm. So he's like saying, since we have that same spirit of faith that they had before us, we also believe and therefore speak because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. Because guys, Christian hope is resurrection hope. That's the treasure in the jar of clay. We read it and we go, oh yeah, like this treasure in jar of clay. Oh wait, what's the treasure? The treasure is resurrection hope. That's what it is. As he's writing, and that's the one thing that actually could change everything for Paul. Otherwise, his suffering was the end of the story. His death was the end of the story, but it wasn't for Paul. It wasn't. And so he can write this in chapter 1. He says, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. See, guys, Paul was a real human being too. He felt these things. He felt despair. He felt depression. He felt brokenness. And yet, not even in that, not in some cliche way, but in the way that like, not in just some like, oh, I hope it gets better, but it wasn't the last word for Paul. Because he continued on, he said this, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but in God, what? Who raises the dead. See, Christian hope is actually resurrection hope. None of this makes sense if our lives are the end of the story. But it isn't, because Jesus flipped suffering upside down through the cross by being raised from the dead. No matter what suffering or despair the early Jesus followers faced, they had hope. Not false hope, hopefully things will get better, but visible, tangible, proven hope that death doesn't get the last word, that God is turning tragedy into transformation, because Christian hope is resurrection hope. We know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. That's what changed everything for Paul. See, but here's a little shift. See, the story of the Bible doesn't teach that heaven is pie in the sky. Sorry, Norman Greenbaum, 70s music reference there for you guys. It's not the spirit in the sky. The Bible doesn't actually teach that disembodied bliss is our hope. That's the doors. That's break on through the other side. That's nirvana. That's Buddhism. That's Hinduism. Instead, Christianity, it doesn't just teach, it proves that our hope can be new life, resurrection life, in the same way that Jesus has already been raised to new life. And guys, I'll just be really honest here. This is really hard for me to wrap my head around. It's like one of the tensions that I feel as a Christian. Because just all these questions come to mind. Well, it's like, okay, well, what happens in between, right? Or what happens like 5 seconds after I die? Or even not that, but like, will it be my body or will it be a new body? Will it be here, there? I don't know. But I don't think the Bible ever actually gives us the answer to those questions. I think the writers of the Bible just present us Jesus. And so we know, not abstractly, not because of an idea or hopefully one day, but we really know that Jesus was raised from the dead, and so that's our hope too. And honestly, guys, the reality is that's why I'm a Christian. Because life would be a whole lot easier if it was just to have my own moral framework, live it out before I die. But in this, Christianity is real life. It gives real life hope to those of us who know that we are fragile, and it actually gives suffering a voice. Because suffering is never a part of God's design, but it also promises that there's a better tomorrow coming. So every single one of our prayers for healing, our cries of loneliness, our heartache and loss, it actually matters. See, Christianity says that God hears, he cares, and he stepped into the story. It actually gives power to our prayers, the permission to cry, the permission to be angry at injustice. Half the Psalms are about lament, and don't hear this and go, oh, this hope tells us that it's going to hurt any less. It just tells us that there's a hope to hang on to. And Paul says, therefore, we do not lose heart. I just wonder, can that be our anthem this year? We do not lose heart, even when we feel shattered to pieces, unable to pick them up, when we've walked through so much loss and disappointment. We do not lose heart, because in Christ a victory is coming. And the hard thing is the living in the in between, right? I just want to finish off with a story and a little illustration. And Paul says, he says, therefore we do not lose heart, though Outwardly, we are wasting away, yet inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. For our light and our momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. See, Christianity is life between two eras. It's the here and the not yet. It's the new creation. God is restoring creation not only to what it was originally, but actually creating something more beautiful, more valuable out of that. And yet it's also, still the old era. It's inaugurated in Jesus. Jesus is the king in his resurrection and ascension, but we also live in this era of sin and death and injustice and suffering. And we live in the now and the not yet. That's the tension of the Christian life. The time between the decisive victory of the cross and the war being over. D-Day was June 6, 1944. This is when the Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, France for the decisive victory in World War II, right? And I can't imagine what it would have been like, but from accounts that we have, it's brutal. But it was the victory that sealed the war. It put an end to the Nazi hopes of domination, brought evil to its knees, and justice was made victorious. It was the end. It was the day that the end began, but not the end itself. See, VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, would actually come almost a year later, May 6th, 1945. And can you imagine the pain of those days? Knowing the war was over, but not over. Any day now that hope would roll up in the form of, soldiers liberating a concentration camp, yet not knowing if that day would be tomorrow or a year from now or ever. And I think this is actually a picture of what our life is like, living in the in-between. So the victory has been won, but Jesus is the suffering victor in his resurrection, but we wait. The war is won, but it's not over. And I think that's why our prayers actually matter. We actually need to pray and ask God to go, hey, you need to bring victory into this area of life. You need to bring the war to become over. Knowing that as we wait, there is hope. I have a neighbor, we grew up with them, and really special, right across the road. They had 6 kids, and we'd always go over there, usually on Saturdays, and she would be baking donuts. I'm talking 120 donuts here, covered the entire kitchen table, and there was none left by the end of the day. And, really special person in our community. And also somebody who has suffered for 30 plus years with a disease that slowly takes you. I don't even know what it's like to live for 30 years, let alone live with a constant reminder that things aren't getting better, and they're not the way they should be. It's the kind of disease that, puts you in a wheelchair, takes your speech, your independence. And this week, my dad and I were talking about it, and we were just talking about, I wonder if people who have suffered that long, if they've actually have a different perspective on life. They've actually already gone through the transformation that all of us are going to go through that comes with suffering with Christ. That at some point, they actually embrace the cracks, because unlike us, they can't hide them. And I guess I just wonder, if she understands in a way deeper way than I do what it actually means to be a follower of Jesus. To follow him through and not around. Because suffering is always bad. It's not God's design. It's a product of a world broken off from God. But suffering can also be a doorway when we walk with the suffering of Jesus. See, if you were a secular person, her life would be a tragedy, right? It would be loss, but it's not the end of the story. So that loss, no matter how heavy, no matter how sad, no matter how long, it becomes light and momentary, because her suffering was neither light nor momentary, but in comparison with the reality of resurrection hope in Jesus. I almost forgot the tent. That would be weird if we didn't mention it. What's the tent for? It's a reminder. It's a reminder for us. And maybe it's an image that'll stick in your brain as you walk out the doors here today. And, Paul was the tent maker himself. And so he finished off our passage and he said this, for we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, then we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven not built by human hands. What is life living like in a tent? It's a real place to live and find shelter, but it's just temporary, often flimsy. And we had gone on in grade 7, 8, something like that. We had gone on a camping trip, and some of my friends, it was clearly their first time tenting because they put their tent on a hill. And then I was looking, I'm like, if it rains, you're going to like literally be where all the water runs. And of course it did rain because that happens every camping trip. And my friend did wake up in a puddle. And see, guys, like, no matter how good of tent you have, sometimes the weather just has different ideas other than your comfort. But the reality is we have a hope because the tent is just temporary. It's not a real home. And here's the shift is that Paul's wanting us to make is maybe heaven isn't the shadow of what this life is, but what if this life is actually the temporary and the flimsy, and what if we're actually waiting for an eternal home? One that is more stable. See, the heavenly resurrection reality will make this life look like the flimsy and the temporary, uncomfortable one when we exchange it for what God made us for all along. I like how C.S. Lewis put it. The same guy we started with. The guy he had gone through tremendous amounts of sorrow and pain. And he put it really, really well, and I just want to read this quote for you guys. He said, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it or suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings. And on the other hand, to never mistake them for something else, of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under, ironic, or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and help others do the same. See, the purpose of today, guys, was to create space for us to have courage. It can be really, really, really hard to look in the mirror and see that this year has really brought a lot of cracks into our life. Whether that's physical brokenness or, emotional or, the loss of experiences, your family, your friends, or jobs. And it can be really hard. It can be a lot easier just to ignore it, just to click on Netflix, just to pretend like those things exist while you're here at church, don't exist while you're here at church. And I just want to say, don't lose heart on the journey, because we're all in this. And I don't know if this is the most entertaining or powerful sermon or whatever. But I just think that this year has really got us looking for more than just entertainment. Like, I think there are a lot of us, and in this community especially, like, what we need is actually real life hope. One that actually speaks courage in the face of fragility. Not one that just distracts us from it. Like there's this really good quote that says, the mountaintop is a really great experience, but all the vegetation grows in the valley. And if you're walking through the valley today, guys, I just want you to know that you're not alone. That doesn't mean that God's not with you. But what if our walk with Jesus actually begins in a year like this? What if in suffering in Jesus becomes not tragedy, but transformation? What if Christian hope is actually resurrection hope, and day by day, step by step, even when we feel like this jar of clay that is just shattered on the floor, I want to encourage you guys, don't lose heart, just keep going. Because every step of faith is another step towards coming out of this valley. So let's finish with the words of Paul. Let's have our hope so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life today.